Welcome everyone to episode 1 of Canon Fodder.
Well, so we've
Do
had
you already
episodes.
want to cut in? I'm
Well,
doing the intro.
Is this episode 1, or have we had? Is the previous one episode 0?
We'll record 2 in. Oh yeah,
This-
that's a possibility too.
That's the intro. This is episode 1, which I am welcoming everyone to. I am here with a panel of non-experts, which include Bucklander, Jeff of A Dormant Dynasty, and Laurentian. And of course, me, Cinder Mountain Villager.
And Bucklander last week was known as Fat Conan.
Yeah, we're working on our brand here at Bucklander Co.
You are working on your brand there.
That's what I
Don't
said.
include us.
We
Not affiliated.
We at Bucklander. Yeah. So
Royal We, the editorial.
exactly.
So today we are discussing book 1 of the Iliad.
So this is from the Fagles translation, Robert Fagles, and this is from line 9. What god drove them to fight with such a fury? Apollo, the son of Zeus and Leto. Incensed at the king, he swept a fatal plague through the army. Men were dying. And all because Agamemnon spurned Apollo's priest. Yet Chryses approached the Achaeans' fast ships to win his daughter back, bringing a priceless ransom, and bearing high in hand, wound on a golden staff, the wreath of the god, the distant deadly archer. He begged the whole Achaean army, but most of all the two supreme commanders, Atreus' 2 sons, Agamemnon, Menelaus, all Argives geared for war. May the god who holds the halls of Olympus give you Priam's city to plunder, then safe passage home. Set my daughter free, my dear one, here. Accept these gifts, this ransom. Honor the god who strikes from world away, the son of Zeus, Apollo. And so the first topic, dear listener, to give you an idea of how these will break down, we will try to hit 4 topics per episode. And the first topic then is what I have been calling relationships and obligations. And what I want people to take from this is to see that many of the relationships in the Iliad, or many of the characters, especially the significant characters, are placed in a context of their relationships and not described by their physical appearance or their characters themselves. And I think that this says something significant about the outlook of the poet, which is to say something like, a man is defined by his community and his obligations to his community. And we will see briefly from here, Apollo comes and deals death to the Greeks, not because he cares particularly for the girl, but because his priest has been ignored and rejected. And so the contracts of relationships has been disrespected, and Apollo is coming down to correct the contract and to correct what is owed to the honor due to his priest. So that's what I'm putting out there.
And we see a lot of sons of, like Agamemnon and Menelaus are the son of, what was their father's name again? Yeah. I
just want to say the three people I can think of that are not talked about in this way, or at least are talked about with actual reference to their character traits, are Achilles, swift-footed Achilles, man killer, etc. Odysseus, clever, tricky, wise, and Hector, man-killing Hector. But they are still placed in a context of relationships as well.
Why do you think it is that they get this exception?
Because they're heroes. They are the heroes. There are the highest tier in the story are old men and heroes. And this would also include Ajax because of the tower shield, the tower Ajax, depending on the translation that you look at.
Is little Ajax talked about in
little Ajax is talked about, but only in the shadow of greater Ajax.
Yeah.
So he's what I would call one of the middlemen who are bound by duty. The old men and the heroes seek glory and plunder, personal gain. The middlemen are bound by their duty to fight for their lords in hopes of scraps. And the undermen, which are your everyman, Bronze Age Greek soldier who was called to fight, their fate is to die under the bow of Apollo, under the sword of Hector, under the command of Agamemnon, fill in the blank.
But that's their contractual obligation.
That's their honor bound. That's their duty obligation. So to point out why.
But duty's a contract.
To point out why the majority of these guys are here is an aspect of this story that's not included in Homer's text, which is there were 12 lords who took an oath to protect the marriage of Menelaus and Helen, and they stood in ceremony to protect Menelaus's marriage. So half of the reason that most of these Greeks are here is because Agamemnon called them up, but the foundation of their duty was because they took this oath, and that's not included in the text.
Yeah, this really shows not only it only shows the rootedness of these people, but also their kind of the antithesis of atomized individualism, where all of these obligations and this honor is all connected in some kind of holistic view of the world. And so it's kind of like it's the complete opposite of what you have today, where you're a soldier. As a soldier, you're more or less a paid mercenary. Whereas to them, it's not about the individual and it's not about gain. It's about if people begin kind of disbelieving or dropping out of this whole, then that is when the whole begins to collapse. I think everybody who's bound by honor kind of in some way recognizes that.
Yeah, I'd echo those points and say that it's about legacy. It's about, they're often mentioned as the son of Atreus or the son of, and there's legacy that these young men are trying to maintain and trying to uphold, and they're willing to put their life on the line for it and do whatever it takes under the even unwise leadership of Agamemnon. They're willing to stake their lives, their farms, their families being away. They're willing to do that for legacy. They're going up against the largest impregnable fortress known to man at the time.
And I would interject that largely a lot of these guys, Agamemnon is not a factor because the Greek Isles at this point were a loose confederation of kingdoms. And Agamemnon was chosen to lead this campaign only because of his proximity to his brother, who was the guy who had the issue. Most of these people, like Odysseus, was a king in his own right. Ajax.
Agamemnon was king of Mycenaea.
Mycenaea, yeah. It was loose confederation of kings.
I suspect he would have been the most powerful anyway, because Mycenaea in 1500 BC is pretty powerhouse. So I think he would have been first amongst equals, regardless,
right.
in pure power anyway.
Yeah, no argument here.
So I think I wanna bring in some Foucault here. And I apologize to anyone with a more sophisticated understanding of Foucault. But I see, going to what Jeff was talking about earlier, one of the criticisms I see of Foucault is that these structures of power that exist in our lives have become abstracted. And whereas you knew what your personal obligations were, you knew who was owed fealty to and who owed fealty to you, increasingly, and you see this in Crime and Punishment, that one of the things that happens with the justice system is this increasingly abstraction of who is administering the punishment and what is owed to who, because you no longer owe something to the victim, you sort of owe something to this thing called society and the group. And I think that sort of gives us a good fulcrum or a good lens to view what's happening prior to the Enlightenment and the abstraction of the state that we see going on here in the obligations, and that's the lens to look at this through. I think, or it's a useful lens to look at it through. Now, I'm not going to end up where Foucault ends up with his solutions, but I agree with his criticisms on that.
So, taking it back to your talk of how this is a question of relations, Chryseis, the priest of Apollo, prays to Apollo. Achilles prays to Thetis, his mother, who's the goddess of the sea, or a sea goddess. Thetis begs Zeus for intervention. Nestor, the oldest of the Greeks, considered a sage unofficially, arbitrates the fight between Agamemnon and Achilles. And he's only able to do so because of his relations. Athena stops Achilles from drawing his sword because of her relation to the mortal world as a goddess. Hephaestus arbitrates the fight between Zeus and Hera because of his position on Mount Olympus. Everything happens because of relation in this first book.
I think one of the things that comes through when you talking about this is there's on the person who's doing the requesting, it often seems quite impulsive. Hey, do this for me, please, right now. And on the person being requested of it, there's reflection. And so and that seems like a good way of doing things. That if you need something done, it's good to ask someone, if not to do it for you, but like, what do you think? Here I have this impulse. And the system of sort of obligations seems to serve as a good sort of cart and horse relationship in terms of getting something done, because you have the person wanting something being pulling you forward, and the cart sort of going steady. What do we need to do? But ultimately, going like, it's never no. It's always, how should I do this? Or like, because Achilles certainly says, like, who am I to argue with Athena and Hera? Far be it from me.
And I also see this as a form of well-functioning hierarchy, because always the lower asking the higher for something, and it's
Well, except for Athena.
okay.
Except for Athena and Achilles.
Yeah, but it's always better that the person that you're asking is more reflective. I mean, it's like how when journalists argue with Trump. That I see is kind of like the modern phenomenon of hierarchy falling apart, because the journalist is the one who doesn't have as much. He's not the one dealing on that higher level that the president of the United States is. The president of the United States is the one dealing with the presidents of the other countries and all the foreign the foreign relations and all the politics at that level.
He's the commander in chief of the United States military.
Yeah.
And the fact that they're prepared to argue with Trump and then doff their caps and tug their forelocks to Biden shows that that's not obligation. You don't choose obligations. You don't choose these relationships. And so, even more so, that it's with one and not the other, it shows that the system is breaking down because they're choosing to support Biden and they're refusing to go along with Trump in the way that they would with Biden.
One of the overarching themes, you could say, that I got from book one is that Agamemnon, in his hubris, perhaps, he chose to kind of mess with this order of things. And sure, he's a king among men, but he is still a mortal, and he doesn't. And sometimes that's the hubris of man, is that we don't understand when we're messing with the gods. We don't really know the true implications of what happens when we mess with the gods.
That's a good point. I like that.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good point.
And so Agamemnon, it's kind of like a power without wisdom, or knowledge without wisdom, or just he didn't know what he was about to get himself into, and about to draw all of his armies and all of the gods into, really. Yeah.
So going forward with an expansion on themes, in this book, old men and heroes set themselves up, arrive on the shores of Ilium, do 9 years of plunder and rape. The old men and the heroes seek glory and plunder. The middlemen are bound to them by their oaths and duty to fight for their lord's hope. They hope themselves for the scraps going forward. And the undermen can only line the paths of their master's glory with their graves.
So in that equation, which do you see as the most honorable?
The men of duty.
I think the most interesting is obviously Achilles, which is probably why he's the hero. I mean, the most interesting to me in that Achilles is going because he's embracing his death. He knows he's going his motivation is to go and earn himself glory and in the process die. So I think that's interesting. And there's something of the poem Ozymandias, right? That I met a traveler from an antique land who said, two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty in despair. Nothing beside remains, round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sand stretch far away. So there's something similar with Achilles there, in that Achilles has been promised glory that will last the ages. And here we are, 3,500 years later, and we're still talking about him. So I think his motivation, unlike Ozymandias, who, most of the plebs today, they're not knowing the Iliad or the details of it, would still almost certainly all have heard. Most of them will have heard of Achilles to some extent.
Well, at least have an idea that he was a great warrior in years past.
I don't even know if they'd know that detail. They just know Achilles. Something to do with Brad Pitt.
Yeah.
That's it, dude. That's how I prepped for this show. Is I watched Troy like 6 times.
Yeah. Well, you'll know more than
Yeah.
us then.
So the poem that you're reciting has to do with
With look at me, look at my destiny. I mean, it's a pretty universal thing, right? Like Gilgamesh goes on a quest to attain immortality, and at the end of it, he doesn't get it. But he does get an immortality of a sort, which is that people will remember him.
Is that Tennyson or Byron? Who is that?
Well, no, I don't know who Gilgamesh, but you're asking about.
No,
I know. It's Shelley. It's Shelley.
Oh, it's Shelley.
but the poem of Ozymandias was saying, look at all the wonderful things that I've
And there's
left
nothing
behind,
there.
and there's nothing there. Those are the wonderful buildings and structures that he's used his slaves to build, whereas you're juxtaposing it against Achilles, who was a brave warrior, really didn't build anything except for his own reputation and honor.
But I think that this is how we can justify that the old men and heroes are in their own way honorable, because they become the heroes of the ages, and they give the peoples something to aspire towards.
And they build those accomplishments on the duty of their underlings and the graves of their underlings.
Yeah.
And it is something of a Faustian bargain, I think. But it's also but there's a counterfactual in that, like, we're not like, none of us are Achilles, right? None, and I don't know that any of us would accept Achilles' bargain. And maybe that's what makes Achilles, that he would accept the bargain. But what Jeff's saying there is these guys like Achilles have performed some good in being in their glory surviving. But the question is, would they have done more good if they had stayed at home and tended their farms and fathered children? And there's, and this is what I mean. We don't know. There's this counterfactual, but
It's also, is their role necessary? Because
There is, because
without without
Go
the
ahead.
ageless or the immortalized hero, does that take something very significant away from future generations?
but does the role of the good father the role of the good honest yeoman who stayed at home and tended his lands. Does the loss of that take away something from future generations as well?
So I would say that the representation of the good man is Odysseus and his attempt, which is not included in the text, to get out of his duty to go to Troy.
I think a really good one on the opposite side as well is Aeneas. Aeneas is about survival, and and though we don't see it, like Aeneas's flight. And I've been to tie in one of my little side quests that might appear at some point. I've been reading Crystal Wolf's Cassandra, and it's really interesting because Cassandra is the daughter of Priam, gifted with visions of the future, and it's about her. It's a sort of a spin-off story about her, and the way that not Cassandra, but this other woman who's with Cassandra, she talks about Aeneas as a traitor, and Cassandra can see Aeneas as a survivor who's doing what he has to do to survive, and the other woman is like, no, he's a traitor. He's the worst of us. He's so I think, yeah, Aeneas is also a survivor. And actually, I would probably say a better example than Odysseus, because Aeneas establishes a nation,
which Aeneas is attributed to founding Rome,
and by extension, Britain, because another one of Aeneas's descendants is Brutus, who goes in the first king of Britain. So Britons are Trojans. I think the other thing is the motive. There's not just this like lower, middle, and greater. There's also young and old, because the bargain, this is done with the blood of young men, right? And I think if you would put the four of us in a room 10 years ago, we would have been much more sympathetic to the glories of these guys. But the four of us are all sort of in our mid 30s, or older, in the case of wise old Nestor. Laurentian heretofore is Nestor. So, 10 years ago, I was dreaming of glory. I remember a very weird thought looking back on it. So I was not yet graduated from high school in 2003. And I remember thinking, don't let the Iraq war start before I can enlist. Now, thank God I didn't enlist. Thank God I didn't go to Iraq. But that impulse was in me.
Yeah.
I can imagine a young boy watching his father go off to Troy, thinking something like, why can't I be old enough to go with them yet?
A young boy like Telemachus, friends listening at home.
So there is, and I don't know which one's right, but
I think
the young men look at the old men and who are talking about like how terrible war is, and they go, you guys are cynics. And the old men look at the young men and they go, you're fools. And I think both are right to an extent. And to be clear, none of us have been to. I don't think any of us have been in the army, but I don't think any of us have been in combat. But we've now lived long enough to know the lies and like the pointlessness of it all.
Well, the Great Meme War, 3rd Division Infantry, right? But I think,
I was in 1st Armored.
There is something really beautiful when it's a just war. I think that's what it is. It's that when it comes to weapons of mass destruction and, or Gaddafi trying to create a gold-backed currency, and then we're being lied into war, then it becomes something really ugly.
I think my cynicism comes into effect where it's like, you can start a just war, but by the time you can't win a just war. By the time you've established victory conditions, like, I don't know that the justice of it all has survived.
And perhaps, there is no kind of universal standard for just war, maybe. But I look at something like the Vikings' view of war, and this idea of dying as a warrior's death, and ascending to Valhalla. That's like within their worldview, that is certainly something that has a beauty to it, right?
Yeah.
A poetic beauty. Yeah.
Yeah. And you're right. Like there's something beautiful about that when you have to muster your courage and stand
Mm.
in the shield wall and kill someone with an axe. And
Yeah.
there is um and there is something, I'm sure the Vikings would say like, what, you dropped a JDAM on some village and like, or like you drone striked, you know,
Yeah.
no, the drone strike pilot isn't going to Valhalla.
Yeah.
Um, but what's interesting about that is to think like this is even if you are listening and you've shot at people, right? Like, you know, that the warfare that developed in the last 250 years is totally different. And it's one of the reasons we can amass armies now in the way we couldn't before. Because it's a lot easier not only to train someone how to, load a musket and shoot, but it's a totally different requirement of mentality to stand
Mhm.
shoulder to shoulder with your bros, shooting at a target 200 meters away. And I don't know where I can't remember the source, but like, writing about like the difference in mentality that's required to actually get up close and shove your sword into the guts, disemboweling some guy like immediately opposite you. And you see this in in the First World War with the trench raids, right? Like where you go from taking pot shots at helmets during the day to at night these like intense periods of terror where like there was just some guy in a trench next to you and you had to like disembowel him with your knife.
Mhm.
And what we're talking about here is the undermen.
Yeah.
Is what Agamemnon wasn't doing this. Nameless Greek soldier number 676 was the guy who was doing this.
Being done to
So,
by Achilles.
well, I mean, being done to by Hector, being done to by one of Paris's honor guards, because he was at the end of the day a prince. So
And
I'm
you'll
just gonna
find this today, right? Like I'm sure there's some statistics out there that says like 5 to 10% of infantrymen do 90% of the kills. I'm sure there's something like that.
The only opinion I'd add on the mind frame of some of these people, and I don't really have it. I'm not a combat veteran, but close hand-to-hand combat, you have to have a different mentality. Something there has to spur you on to get you there in the first place because you're treating. So what is that? Again, going back to that legacy or feeling of providing, there's something else motivating you spiritually. But I also include something I say quite a bit, and this is just from my livestock or my farming background, in that if you're if you're used to livestock, you have to see, and in order to kill livestock on a regular basis, is you can't see these animals as having souls or being people or somebody
no
to relate to.
no Disney story, no Charlotte's Web.
There's no Charlotte's Web if you're having to approach somebody with a sword and kill it. And even animals that you're going to eat, you have to have that mind frame and that mentality in order to do that, which I'm sure a lot of these soldiers were exposed to at a young age of what livestock was and how to kill. So as the technology has evolved for warfare, the mind frame of the soldier has also changed, where they're not used to taking something's life, whether it's got 4 legs or 2. They don't have, I'm picturing it not being the same.
So quick, I want to expand on that in 3 parts. This is exemplified in, for those of us who have gone that dark, looked at the beheading videos that ISIS or any one of these sort of disparate Islamic groups that look at this, like, there's no Marine Corps, there's no unit. I mean, there's some issues, but nobody in the United States military is releasing videos of cutting someone's head off or burning someone in a cage or drowning someone or all these execution videos. The level of detachment that you need to take someone fully connected to their body and separate their head via their neck from their body is a different mentality. So I just want to ask you, Laurentian, what has been the most disastrous animal execution that you've had to? Oh, he has to check out for 5 minutes. Oh, nuts.
I'm good. I'm good here. I'll answer that question if you wouldn't mind. And then, yeah, so I'd have to say that animals get themselves, I'd have to preface that question by saying animals get themselves into situations which they can't get out of. And you have to assist them getting out of them one way or another. And we have a responsibility because we tend to we put them in situations that aren't natural for them. So they're in an enclosed area, or they're in an area where they have proximity to things that aren't natural, like a building or a well or a in between two rocks. So they often end up in precarious situations. And one of those situations that comes to mind for me was a younger calf. Say she was about 6 months old, and it was in a situation where I'd left a latch open for the night, and she got her head caught in there. I knew it was my fault, and there was no way she was getting out. So I had to dispose of this animal with my bare hands. I had no gun. I had no medication to treat it properly, but I knew what I had to do in order to dispose of it.
How did you do that?
I took a lead pipe and I hit it over the head, probably
Okay.
3 or 4 times until it blacked out. But that's a fair size. That's a 300 or 400 pound animal. Then I can relate to also there was a time when we had a disease go through the farm. There was several animals that were just they just literally drop like flies. They were full of clostridial bacteria, and they go down one day to the next. And I there was one day we lost 6, and they'd be struggling on the ground trying to get up, flailing their arms. Whereas the day before, you'd fed them and they're alive and healthy.
Mm.
And you don't have a gun, you don't have any typical medication to euthanize them, so you've got to hit them on the head with it. And when you do that enough, 12, 13, 14 times, you become and a lot of men experience this when they're butchering animals. You become you become numb to the feeling of it, and you become numb to the attachment to what life is. You don't, and I'm not trying to draw the connection to human beings too much, but there has to be some kind of connection between the soldier stabbing someone and killing an animal. I'd make sure I'd see that as a more ability to understand their position a lot easier because
I
they've done
have
it before repeatedly.
I have something contrarian to say. And it's not that I'm defending ISIS and their cruelty towards their fellow man, but I look at this perhaps an older view of war is this idea of something that the warrior has dedicated his life towards. And he knows that the opponents that he's meeting on the battlefield are probably also warriors who've dedicated their lives towards this endeavor. And so it's kind of similar to two UFC fighters meeting in the octagon. It's not that it's necessarily you look at the other person as not a person. In some ways, it's even more personal because you're looking at a fellow warrior and you're meeting this fellow warrior out on the battlefield, knowing that you've both prepared your whole life for this moment. And it would be a great honor to challenge your skills against them.
That reminds me of the misattributed Heraclitus quote. Out of every 100 men, 10 shouldn't even be there. 80 are just targets. 9 are the real fighters, and we are lucky to have them, for they make the battle. But the one is a warrior, and he will bring the others back.
So, Buck, you wanted to transition us into the next segment, right?
So,
perhaps you can work with this, but for discussion 3, I have the gods are selfish and cruel. Like the old men and heroes, they think only of their glory and gain. Boredom and vanity are the 2 plagues of Mount Olympus.
yes, they envy the mortals. One of the ideas that's come up about the gods is like there's an envy because men can die, and so they have something at stake.
They have much more at risk.
They've got skin in the game.
And thus their deeds are better and more virtuous because of that sacrifice.
Okay, so I've got two good readings here. So I'll read them and then again re-record them. But Achilles rounded on Agamemnon once again, lashing out at him, not relaxing his anger for a moment. Staggering drunk with your dog's eyes, your fawn's heart, never once did you arm with the troops and go to battle, or risk an ambush packed with Achaea's picked men. You lack the courage. You can see death coming. Safer by far you find to foray all through the camp, commandeering the prize of any man who speaks against you. King who devours his people. Worthless husks, the men you rule. If not Atrides, this outrage would have been your last. I tell you this, and I swear it with a mighty oath upon it. By this scepter, this scepter, look, that never again will put forth crown and branches. Now it's left its stump on the mountain ridge forever, nor will it sprout new green again. Now the brazen axe has stripped its bark and leaves, and now the sons of Achaea pass it back and forth as they hand their judgments down, upholding the honored customs whenever Zeus commands. This scepter will be the mighty force behind my oath. Someday I swear a yearning for Achilles will strike Achaea's sons and all your armies. But then, Atrides, harrowed as you will be, nothing you do can save you, not when your hordes of fighters drop and die, cut down by the hands of man-killing Hector. Then you will tear your heart out, desperate, raging that you disgrace the best of the Achaeans. And sorry, that was a bit longer. This is the last one I want to read. The father of men and gods replied sharply, Hera, stop hoping to fathom all my thoughts. You will find them a trial, though you are my wife. Whatever is right for you to hear, no one, trust me, will know of it before you, neither god nor man. Whatever I choose to plan apart from all the gods, no more of your everlasting questions. Probe and pry no more. So the first was from about line 262, and that one was from about line 655. I want to weave those together briefly. Between Achilles and Agamemnon, Agamemnon is saying, hey, I want what's rightfully mine. If my dignity as king and overlord of this operation suffers, that's not right. But I still want my men to live. And then Achilles says to him, and it's one of my favorite lines in book one, king who devours his people. And so Agamemnon, the people are there to feed Agamemnon's desires. Agamemnon isn't there to look after his people.
Mm.
So I think there's an interesting thing going on there. And then Zeus's command to the gods, who are also quite sort of petty and childlike, if not more so, to hit the second of the gods, the queen of the gods, is to say, trust the plan. Cue Zeus, right? Cue Zeus. Hera, trust the plan.
This brings up an interesting discussion. I don't know how much time we want to spend on it though, but it brings up the question of when is it okay? At what point do kings lose the mandate of heaven, basically? It's when is it okay to finally call a king a tyrant and rebel against him, perhaps?
And that's when we see a warrior with a 1 foot in heaven. That's his job, to call out the king. So by my reading, the Greeks have the sanction of Hera and Athena, not Agamemnon. Nobody's fighting for Agamemnon. Zeus isn't even fighting for Agamemnon or the Greeks. He is cocking to the multiple relationships that he has on Mount Olympus that sway what's going on. Because as I recall, Ares fights for the Trojans. The god of war fights for the Trojans. But the goddess of wisdom fights for the Greeks. And the whole reason that the Trojans are fighting the Greeks is because the goddess of love deceived the prince of the Trojans for her own personal gain. So, back to your point, a warrior with the unofficial mandate of heaven is meant to call out and subvert those with the historical mandate of heaven. Only the mandate of heaven can cancel out the mandate of heaven.
Yeah. If I can bring a little Bible in, the Bible says that all powers are put there by God, good or bad.
Mm-hmm.
And and render unto Caesar's that which is Caesar's, but also so do the things that are reasonable that are asked of you by these powers, but don't compromise your faith, don't compromise your principles, and if that means suffering, then suffer, but be true. All powers are there by God, tyrants are not. I think from a biblical perspective, the argument would be something like a tyrant isn't someone not put there by God. A tyrant is someone who's put there by God who then behaves in a tyrannical manner. I don't know if that's relevant though. That could be cut. I'm not married to what
Oh,
I just said.
that's well, that's kind of the answer that I am looking for when I pose that question.
These are your two readings were challenges by Achilles against Agamemnon, his leader. So is it a question of leadership or a question of Agamemnon that Achilles is challenging?
I'd like to put myself in a position of Agamemnon and try just for a minute to empathize with his position, as difficult as that is. Maybe a small amount of what he's doing we could try and empathize with. He's number one. He's the number one guy. At least he's being painted in this picture to be the top of that group and of very esteemed gentlemen. And he, again, I'm going back to how he's trying to motivate these great men, and I think he feels insecure at that point. And I think I see him feeling challenged all the time, especially by Achilles, because Achilles, he's not of great material wealth. He's not someone who's I believe he's referred to is he doesn't have piles of gold. He spread them out amongst his men. I know of no troves of treasure piled lying idle anywhere. Whatever we dragged from towns we plundered, all's been portioned out, but collected, call it back from the rank and file. That would be a disgrace. So return the girl to the god, at least for now. We Achaeans will pay you back 3-4 times over, if Zeus will grant us the gift somehow, someday, to raise Troy's massive ramparts to the ground. So this is before he really gets aggressive with Agamemnon. He appeals to him and he says, just how, Agamemnon, great field marshal. So he's speaking to him, trying to calmly debate with him. But Agamemnon's apparently not having any of it. He wants his piece because Achilles has his piece, and he sees the rivalry and the competition. They both want the same thing. They both have the same desires, and Agamemnon feels slighted by that somehow. He's insecure because he's the top dog, because he's number one. There's nowhere else for him to go. He is a mortal man, and he's in the position he's in. So his leadership, he calls into question his own leadership through his insecurity. And you could see that reflecting in his behavior throughout the themes. He's angry when he's speaking with people. He's not consoling. You don't see him trying to extrapolate any or extract any tactical situations. He's dealing with petty issues continually just to satisfy his insecurity and his ego. And that really is the sign of that lack of insecurity and understanding and listening is the sign of a bad leader. And I myself personally have been in that position of being a bad leader. And it can lead to very tragic events in your life if you're not able to at least learn from that situation. And it doesn't appear that Agamemnon has the humility to do that. He just feels constantly under threat and attack, and he doesn't have a real footing on the situation. And Achilles picks up on it and exploits it.
I think if I can tell a personal anecdote in fairly vague terms, I always wanted to be a leader, and I always thought like that was where respect was. That's where, and that's what I wanted. And I grew up in a childhood without any control over what happened to me, and bad things, not the worst things, but like where my home was chaotic and it wasn't ideal. Single mother household, the sort of same story. And I thought like, well, what I need is control. And who has control? Looking back, I realize this is the thought process. What I need is control. And how do I have control? Well, I become a leader. And I in the smallest sort of peanuts little like election of an association, I ran against my best friend because I thought my best friend wasn't going to be a strong enough like leader with the body that we engaged with in this association. And I was running on the I will stick it to them platform. But I wasn't the people who liked me loved me, and a lot of people didn't, and they didn't dislike me, but I wasn't their favorite. I was just sort of like whatever. And I ran and I lost significantly. Um, and this prompted me to reflect on this. And I realized the dichotomy is not follower leader, although that is what you see in the Odyssey. um, you don't need to be a leader. And if you're not a leader, it's best to not try and become a leader. If you are a leader that needs to develop as a leader, by all means, develop as a leader. But if your personality type is not a leader, then I don't think you should become a leader. And I say that from personal experience. Because what this process caused me to reflect on was I definitely wasn't a follower, but I'm definitely not a leader. And again, to make a biblical reference, the character that I landed on was John the Baptist as my sort of inspiration, as the lone voice crying in the wilderness. And I realized that's what I was, is that I wasn't John the Baptist, but I was that sort of character, that I'm an individual. I have to follow my own path. And I think that many people, people forget that that's an option, but B, people are trying to be things that they're not meant to be. And
Mhm.
this will segue into our next topic. So I'll put it on hold there. But one of the things, but just to bring it back, men who are leaders, men who are in positions of leadership that should not be leaders are disastrous. And a good symptom to prove that, or a good example of someone who's not meant to be there, is someone who's using their position of leadership to enrich himself, to further his own causes instead of the causes of the people that he's there for.
Mhm. Yeah. I don't know if you guys have seen the Jordan Peterson interview with Jonathan Pajot, but in that they do talk about, they have quite a detailed segment about leadership. And one of the things Pajot says that quite often our modern conception of leadership ignores or obscures is that leadership is also about responsibility. I think he used the example of someone like a pastor or a church father, where when you bring someone into your flock, you're helping him with bearing the load that the world is putting on him, right? And so it's not just about you issuing orders or telling the person below you what to do. It's also the fact that you're taking responsibility for him.
Mm.
That maybe that's one clear way of distinguishing between tyranny and leadership. Is your leader also taking you under his wing in terms of responsibility? So it's a two-way transaction.
Well, so I think that's a really good idea to tie us into the bit I read about Zeus, which is Zeus is the ultimate leader in all of this. Everything is flowing from him. And, the little speech he gives to Hera, I mean, one of the things I get from this is he's the one that isn't acting like a child. And he's herding cats, both mortal and immortal cats.
Mhm.
And it's very heavy lies the crown. Hera, you have no idea the things I have to deal with.
Yeah.
You'll know when you need to know. And so often, like, oh well, why hasn't our leader done this? The naivety of the expectations of the plebs about what our leaders should be doing is incredible. Like, why wasn't that statue taken down years ago? I don't know. Maybe because we had a standoff in the Ukraine, or like, you know the last thing on people's mind, the last thing on someone who's got like the nuclear codes is, oh, there's a civil war. There's a bronze guy that did something mean 200 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's the thinking of, again, going back to the Biden Trump thing, like, people the reporters would respect Biden going like, things are moving behind the scenes, can't get into it yet. And Trump were to say that, they'd treat him like a fool. But yeah, so heavy lies the crown is, I think part of that. The stresses of, and every man will experience this, or every man who is following the commands of God and nature will experience this.
So the job of a leader is to remove roadblocks, not introduce them. It's to put people in positions of power that he trusts and then work for their success.
Can I sort of add something to that, which
Please.
is the leader sets the mission, and the leader's goal is to put the people underneath him on the specific tracks that are needed to accomplish that mission. And he needs to then, as much as possible, A, get out of the way, and B, do what he can to help remove obstacles on their specific tracks, and also obstacles that appear on the general project's track.
On the periphery. Well. Yeah, he's got to fight him. He's the shield, and his department heads are the sword.
But I think this is a very Tolkien idea, that the anarcho-monarchism, that the king is not there to micromanage. As much as possible, the kingdom needs to unfold as it will, and the king is only there really as like crisis management.
And quite often this is the reactionary argument against the form that the current state or the states of modernity exist in. It's that they are here to micromanage every aspect, every little detail of our lives.
And I think you can make an argument against the opposite of socialism, the hyper capitalism that we see, of a similar line, that if we let the market dictate every little part of our lives, that is the same. It's the source of authority is either the market or the people. It amounts to the same thing.
But
and so
the market is a function of whoever holds power.
Sure, if you want to put it that way. Well, I'm not sure I would say that universally or ideally. I would say that the Bucklander position, the forthcoming Bucklander manifesto, would try to rethink that, but I can see why everywhere you look today, that's the case.
Yeah, I'm right. You're wrong. Argumentation over.
But yeah, I really thought, I really, like I said, my favorite line from the book, from book one, is that you devour men. And I think of a bad leader. Just think of the 20th century. Think of bad leaders, and
think of Trump.
They can, well, not Trump.
No, think of Trump. Take it to its logical conclusion.
Well, I don't think so. Well, I don't see it. You'd have to tell me how. But the bad leaders of the last 100 years consume men.
Oh yes.
They consume men. And I think of I have a affection for one regime in the 20th century, which would be Salazar. And there's something kind of benign, and there is something a little bit anarcho about Salazar, right? Where he just goes his ministers come to him and he goes, "We need to teach the peasants to read," and he's like, "How would that help?" It's just they're peasants. They work on the farms. Reading would just make them unhappy because they wouldn't trust the priest. All these ideas would start coming to them what is the benefit of them reading? There's something a little bit if a peasant wants to read, he'll learn to read. But I'm not going to sit here and make peasants read unless we forget.
It's like we should teach the toddlers to drive,
But lest we forget, why do we want people to read? Well, or what is the modern education system based off of? It's based off of Bismarck's Prussia and the need to produce soldiers and factory workers. It's not there to produce contentment or happiness or
even well-functioning people.
Right. So I would say look, if you want to read by all means, but and this is a silly example, but I still think it plays that A friend once said this to me, that the most and he was referencing Ivanka Trump. This was like 2017, so Trump had just been in power, and like the role of Ivanka Trump was becoming apparent. And he said, you know what the most dangerous words in the English language are now is "daddy." Something must be done.
Oh,
And it was I can't remember what it was, but there was like some like I don't know if there's something that happened or he was anticipating something, but he's just like, just imagine if in like some warlord or something happens in like Darfur and Ivanka just goes in and goes, "Daddy, look at this.
Daddy,
Something
we need boots on the ground.
right, something must be done." And then just that's the attitude I think of these systems that we're beholden to now, which is like there's a problem or there's something going on, something must be done. It might not be Ivanka saying it to her dad. It is the people saying it to the system, like something must
Mhm.
be done. Well, how about let it run its course? I take a fairly natural, organic view of this as much as possible. How about let it run?
The only thing I'd add to that is, are we allowed to be leaders anymore? Are we allowed to be leaders in a good way or a negative way? Or is there just a whole bunch of people out there trying to grab as much power as possible? Like
Mm.
and
Yeah.
you can make that argument for the 45th president. Like, was he really, he didn't have all the tools to do the job. We know that. But would we even be able to have a true leader? Is our culture able to accept that? And I'd argue that we don't have, our main problem isn't bad leadership, it's no leadership, in that we have these oligarchical structures basically wrestling over power all the time, and we're stuck obey, trying to obey them. We can't even obey them. God has been lost, or any inspiration beyond atheism has been lost. Are we even allowed to be leaders?
I think on one level, yes, we are. The question is, are we prepared to pay the price? So I have this view of like every country's a democracy, right? Every country chooses to allow its leaders to continue. So like even North Korea is a democracy. If there really was this motivation to like, and I mean I realize it's a rather like extreme position, but the question is like obviously North Koreans haven't gotten to a point in which they think it's worth removing
Right. Now, yeah, the only reason I hesitate is North Korea has one of the largest armies per capita on the planet.
but
So
the army's
I
made up of
get
people.
right.
Mhm.
I get where you're coming from. The only reason I hesitate is
There's still a calculus going on where people say like and there is a tipping point. There is going to be a tipping
yeah.
point where like
There is a
Romanians
calculus.
where
Sorry.
Romanians rise up and they line Ceausescu against the wall and his wife and shoot him, right? Like
Sure,
that
sure,
that,
sure.
that happens. Um,
Right.
but
So
that is extreme, and I realize I'm not saying like North Koreans deserve it.
no. So
Mm.
I would just say that leadership is possible if you are willing to accept the responsibilities and or consequences. And with that, I would like to address conclusions. So I'll take the first one.
Okay.
I believe the gods are selfish and cruel. I believe
So
Athena,
cynical.
Hera, and Aphrodite started this war. And this war was started particularly with a lie told by the goddess of love to the prince of Troy that started a 10-year war that would ravage mankind for the next 5,000 years. The heroes, the gods, and the old men think only of their glory and gain. Boredom and vanity are the two plagues of Olympus, and in over 5,000 years, nothing has changed.
I think to play off of that, I'll say that politics, as much as we like to deny it nowadays, politics has always been about personal drama. And so, in different stages of the kind of central actors' lives, you had Zeus, once a great hero for himself and his siblings. And then now he's kind of fallen back into this role of managing all the little infighting between that same group. And so we like to think of politics nowadays in the modern conception as just a system operating. But when we look back at the classics, I think they remind us that it's not about systems and abstractions and constitutions. It's always about personal drama.
I'd add that of the situational experience that what these men are going through and as men and what they're having to face from their leader, from Agamemnon, and his inability to lead, his insecurity in his position, something that where we can find ourselves through our own personal experiences, where we're not able or not ready to be able to tackle the task at hand and to truly achieve it by putting ourselves aside and seeing things for the way they are and using all the tools available to us in order to achieve our dreams, which are often, driven by our own egos. So I'd, in conclusion, say that we need to use this part of the book or we need to understand the leadership aspect, how we play with it, and how can we learn from it, because it's common that, as Cinder said, this is replaying itself over and over and over again throughout history. These are common themes, and we need to learn from it, and that's why we're here. We're trying to understand how these lessons can apply 5,000 years ago and how they can apply today, and why is that relevant? Why are we still talking about the dynamic between Agamemnon and Achilles?
I think for me, there's 2 points. One just come up from what Jeff said, which is about what motivates this. And I agree, most of the time, this stuff is motivated by personalities and personal drives and squabbles. But as Jeff mentioned, but look at Zeus at the beginning. Look at Zeus's role at the beginning. Zeus was a hero. But why was Zeus a hero, and why were the gods? What has happened from then till now, where Zeus is presiding over chaos? The gods have lost a unifying purpose. When they have a unifying purpose that is also noble, they work together. And I would say something along the same lines, like the Greeks, when they have a unifying purpose to rightfully get Menelaus's wife back, they clearly things were working. And what we're witnessing is they're forgetting their purpose and it's breaking down. And that's one of the things that it's just come to me from what Jeff said. But my final thought is something. So in my translation, book 1 is called The Rage of Achilles, which is fitting, but I think a more fitting title would be something like The Rage of Everybody, because what we're seeing in this book is everybody's angry. Everybody's pissed off that things aren't, and this goes again to Jeff's point. Everybody's pissed off because they have lost their purpose. They have lost their raison d'etre, however you say it. And everybody's angry. Everybody's emotional because they have lost perspective on their purpose, which goes to the failure of leadership, which goes to the motivations that brought them there, and the relationships and obligations that they all have to one another. And I think that ties it all together.
That's a home run, I think.
I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. I'd like to encourage anyone who's interested to join IronAgeArchive.com.
And our forthcoming Patreon.
Yeah. Well, email us.
Well, the Bucklander Patreon.
So thank you everyone for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Please
very
subscribe
much.
or find IronAgeArchive.com.
Links in the description.
Hit the notification button.
Yeah, it really helps.
It really helps the algorithm.
From everyone on the Iron Age team, I want to thank you for joining us, and have a good night.
Hey, you made it to the end. Good for you. The Iron Age Archive Project is excited to offer NFTs on OpenSea, the world's largest NFT marketplace. Each unique set is specific to an episode and one of a kind. Own a piece of Iron Age history. I mean, not literally, though you do own it, just not from the historical period. It's a figurative Iron Age, but you will own it literally. But you do know that it's digital, right? Oh, this is bad copy. But it's too late to change it now. Exclusive Iron Age Archive NFTs now on OpenSea. Outbid your friends. Outbid your family. Outbid your mortal enemies with Iron Age Archive NFTs. Links in the description.